Hi there. Time for another chapter reading. So we're going into chapter 3 of my first novel entitled The Weight of Light. Just another little bit to get us through this time of isolation and turmoil kind of that's going on around us. So anyway, a little bit of escapism, distraction. That's what stories are for. So I hope you enjoy. Chapter 3, Present Day. And then here's a quote. War broke out within the heavens, and the number that fell were as numerous as the stars, streaking through the sky, plummeting down to the earth. The Book of Irene, 17, verse 3. Saturday early afternoon found Zoe with a large paper takeout cup of her favorite mocha in hand on her way over to Nana's house. Her house. She corrected herself again with a sharp pang. She had traded her severe work suit today in favor of an old, faded, comfy pair of belted, low-rise jeans and a snug, wash-worn, white V-neck t-shirt with a faded black brushed cotton zip-up hoodie, thick socks, and tall, well-broken-in Doc Marten boots. She'd pulled her long hair back into a low ponytail and wore no makeup. A black Life is Good ball cap completed her casual ensemble. This was her third trip today with her boxed up belongings. By supper time, she should pretty much have everything except for the largest stuff transferred over. She'd arranged a moving truck to bring the articles too heavy or awkward for her to carry or fit into her car, and they'd come and gone already. Last night, she'd slept soundly and felt rested and cautiously optimistic. She'd slept in until 9:30, a decadent, luxurious feeling. Before leaving the apartment, she had sent another email to her very best friend in the world, Bree, telling her briefly what had transpired in the last few weeks. Bree was due back soon from an extended vacation in Italy and Greece with her family. Zoe had missed her friend even more than she had anticipated. However, as much as she missed her, she'd wait to tell her about Nan's passing rather than cast a shadow on Bree's vacation time. Her friend Brianna was a musician, actually more of a musical genius. She sang with the raw, sultry voice of a fallen angel, had the gorgeous face of a seductress, and the lithe body of a dancer. Musically, she fit in nowhere, being a unique blend of jazz, Celtic, blues, and folk genre, but in spite of that, or perhaps because of it, was booked almost solid in clubs and venues all over the country for the next 2 years, and then some. The two of them had met in college in a women's history elective, gone out for coffee, and sparked a dazzling friendship that had not stopped talking since. Zoe rubbed the stiffness that had settled in her neck muscles. Since waking, she had experienced 3 more of those mini episodes, as she was beginning to refer to them. That, while still alarming, had thankfully not even come close to being as debilitating as last night's cataclysmic experience. She was grateful that they even seemed to be decreasing in intensity. The last one had been just a mere echo of the upheaval that had rocked her world the first time. It was weird, but she seemed to have raised a sense of sensitivity since then as well. Almost a second sight, as if all of her senses had been augmented, somehow expanded, both inward and outward, as though she had grown new nerve endings, synapses, new hypersensitive antennae, quivering with each waft of new informational breezes. She was still highly concerned about the actual cause of the experiences and needed to figure out the trigger for them, but so far had not been able to piece together anything definitively. She prayed she wasn't getting sick with something. The only other thing that she could think of was that the box the lawyer had given to her had triggered something inside of her. She worried her bottom lip with her teeth, lost in thought. However, the task at hand took priority, and she determinedly shook off her anxieties. She pulled up into the driveway from the back lane behind the house and put the car into park. Trudging back and forth across the backyard and through the back door, she managed the carload in several trips. Inside the house, she looked around. She could still feel her Nana here, a vague, comforting presence and a melancholic reminder of loss. The thread of tears prickled the back of her eyelids again. Brusquely, she rubbed her hands over her face and picked up the box she'd set down. She carried it up the stairs to her old room and set it down on the bed. It felt so heartbreakingly sweet, standing there in the room that she had lived in for so many years. It just didn't feel real that Nan was actually gone. It seemed as though she might walk through the door any minute and give her a hug and tell her it was time to wash up and come down to eat. She'd forced herself back to the present. So we went downstairs again and grabbed her bag and keys off the small, intricately carved antique table that stood guard by the back door. She activated the alarm code on the keypad by the door that she'd installed before she moved in, thinking she'd better be cautious if she didn't want strange men in her house, whether they were a figment of her imagination or not. Not to mention that there were times she brought home priceless manuscripts occasionally to work on into the wee hours of the night. After shooting the deadbolt home, she walked out to her car, noting the faint glimmering evidence of the autumn in the color of the leaves, where light frost had touched the leaves with feathering fingertips. Her mind went to Grizz, her cat, and she hoped he would settle in without too much fuss. She'd informed him of the coming move to Nana's, and though she always felt a little silly talking to him, he always looked at her so intently, as if he really did understand her. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking, but the way he looked back into her eyes made her think he really was processing her words, and even her thoughts. Yep, I'm well on my way. Gonna die crazy and alone, just me and my cat, she wryly chuckled to herself. On her way back to her apartment to pick him up, she remembered she needed to pick up cream for her coffee in the morning and a couple of other little things. She looked up at the sign of the street she was driving down and recalled a small convenience store a few blocks away she'd noted when a couple of years ago she'd gotten a bit off track, daydreaming as usual on her way over to Nan's for supper. She had instant misgivings as she pulled into the tiny, scarred and rutted parking lot. Alarm bells went off in her head and her belly clenched. It was worse than she remembered. Even though it wasn't that far from Nan's, it wasn't a great area, and once grand old houses had become neglected and run down. She'd be lucky if the cream wasn't a year past its expiry date, or didn't get held up by someone robbing the place. Maybe she should just pass. Indecision warred inside her. Oh, hell, I'll just be quick. How bad could it be? She made a mental note to carefully check the dates on the cartons and double-timed it into the small convenience store, quickly making her purchases without incident, and trotted right back out. Sweet. Done. No sweat. Even had a week left on the cream carton. She punched the button on her key fob to unlock her car door and juggled the 2 plastic bags and purse to free her other hand in order to pull open her car door. From the corner of her eye, Zoe saw a shadow from the even darker shadows stealthily detach itself from the dead trees lining 2 sides of the unevenly asphalted parking lot. Shit. A small, mid-height, grimy-looking man wearing a torn dark hoodie and a ragged pair of dirty jeans suddenly materialized on her right. Dirty blonde hair stuck out from underneath a beat-up trucker's cap. She carefully pulled her shoulders back and looked him straight in the eye, stopping his advance momentarily. "Excuse me, miss. You got the time?" He offered her a small, crooked, quite unreassuring grin, sidling closer to her, his quick eyes darting from side to side, from her watch to her purse and into her car windows and back to her face. Oh, this is bad. Very bad, she thought. Yeah. Hang on, Zoe said warily, refusing to be intimidated and trying desperately to figure out a plan, and pinned him with what she hoped looked like a "don't try anything or I'll whoop your ass" kind of stare. She turned her wrist slightly so that she could see the face of her watch, at the same time taking a small step away from him, though any escape was neatly cut off by him and her open car door. Damn it. It's just about 2:30. Oh, crap. She caught a quick, sharp glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Too close. The punk was suddenly way too close. She braced, tensing her body to summon up the self-defense moves from her mind she'd learned at a long-ago class, when she saw him abruptly refocus his gaze to a point above and behind her and awkwardly stumble back a step. Eyelids peeled back unbelievably wide, he scrambled several panicked steps backward, still wielding his wicked-looking blade, but now holding his hands up in an appeasing, surrendering gesture. Taking another couple quick backward steps, now mumbling an apology, he suddenly jammed his hands along with the knife back into his hoodie pockets, turned and fled the parking lot as if his tail were on fire. Zoe whirled around then, searching behind her, half expecting to see maybe the store clerk behind her wielding a shotgun. Nope. Nothing. She swiftly scanned the immediate area once, twice, but still could not detect anything around her out of the ordinary, wondering what he could possibly have seen that would have caused his rapid, obviously terrified retreat. She caught a glimpse of the cashier's pasty, terrified face peering at her through the glass. Yeah, no help there. She threw her bags into the passenger seat and jumped into her car, starting it and throwing it into gear in one swift motion. Holy Mother of God, what the hell just happened? That guy nearly mugged me, and then he took off like a bat out of hell. What could have spooked him that bad? As she drove, Zoe's mind churned. So did her stomach. Not that it actually mattered what had scared the guy off, as long as he was gone, but she knew it certainly hadn't been her intimidating 5'3" frame, or her spectacular self-defense moves. She was grateful, but she sure as hell wasn't sticking around to figure it out or report it. The spineless clerk could file a report if he wanted. She glanced into the rear-view mirror and recalled the thug's shady behavior. I was almost mugged. Or maybe worse. Lord. She drew in a shaky breath and slowly blew it out, not realizing she'd been holding it in. Maybe much worse. Whatever. Lesson learned, message received. Never going back there again, ever. The sun was sinking towards the horizon when Zoe pulled into the drive for the last time that day. She had taken 2 more loads of boxes after her scare, blocking it out of her mind as best she could, but had finally managed to get everything transferred over, with this final car load consisting of Grizz, her toiletries, overnight bag, and cardboard box in the lawyer, with a bag of takeout food for her supper. Zoe loved the neighborhood where Nan's house was located. It was still inside the city, but time seemed to have stood still here. The area had an air of private majesty. Houses here were set further back and apart from one another, with impressively deep, gracious front lawns, massive ancient trees, and thick hedges. The beautiful, stately old trees sheltered the street, enveloping the regal homes in dignity and security, with a sense of comfortable, long acquaintance. In spite of the feeling of orderly, well-maintained stability, there was also an air of unprepossessing charm and originality. Each was honored for its own unique persona. Zoe was brought back to reality by an almost inaudible growl. Zoe smiled to herself. Grizz was very definitely not pleased to be in his carry crate, as evidenced by the occasional grumble that filtered through the door. The crate usually meant he was going to visit the vet, and that was not his favorite place to be, even though he was always unfailingly a gentleman. The infrequent trips to the veterinarian for checkups were simply an abject indignity to be borne with his trademark aristocratic tolerance, with an occasional growl. It was very obvious that he was quite above the usual yowling, spitting, scratching, wretched felines in the waiting room. He simply sat still, upright, as if he were royalty, surveying the lower masses beneath him. Even that day over 4 years ago, when she had opened the back door of her apartment building, taking out the bag of trash, and seen the huge green eyes in the tiny bedraggled mess of wet gray fur next to the dumpster, he had looked at her with such an enormous sense of dignity for something that weighed only a few paltry ounces. That profound dignity in such a tiny, scraggly package had forced a small grin to her lips, just when she felt she had so little then to make her smile. She'd coaxed him into her with a promise of a warm meal, ear rubs, and a welcoming lap. He had soberly considered her offer, carefully sniffing her outstretched hand, eyes holding hers, and then deigned to accept her proposition. He had busied himself almost immediately, taking on his task very seriously, filling up the void inside of her that was fresh and painful, that haunting sense that she was lacking, missing something essential inside of her that her fiancé had left in her life when things had ended so disastrously a few weeks prior. That horrible, sneaking, cruel suspicion that she was fundamentally, irredeemably flawed, unlovable. When she was a child, Zoe had secretly yearned for a dog, with a dog's uncomplicated, unquestioning devotion, their unfailing acceptance. She'd never been especially drawn to cats. However, dogs were not permitted in her apartment complex, and so reluctantly she'd gone without animal companionship. But Grizz had instantly melted her heart, and so he had stayed, and she was so happy now that he had. He'd blended himself into her life perfectly, as though he'd always been there, making very few demands, and giving her a sense of comfort and connection to another living creature that she hadn't realized she'd craved. It was so funny, so unexpected, how often animals were just able to answer questions you'd never even thought to ask. Zoe brought the last of her things inside, then Grizz's travel crate, and crouched down to unclip the door and invite him out. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped out, his rich green eyes huge and curious, sniffing the air and craning his neck, trying to look at everything all at once, yet still trying to maintain his dignity. Zoe laughed and said softly, "This is it, bud. Have a look. It's our place from now on. You and me. Make yourself at home." After familiarizing him with where she had set up his litter box, food, and water bowls, Zoe opened her paper bag of fast food. As she pulled out the heavenly-smelling fare, the large silver cat began his cautious exploration. She enjoyed healthy meals. She really did. But after the long, arduous days she'd had, hell, the long, arduous month, the last thing that she wanted to do was cook something, anything. So she detoured to her favorite fast food place and picked up a huge, juicy cheeseburger loaded up with bacon, lettuce, pickles, hot peppers, extra tomato slices, mayo, mustard, and ketchup, plus a large order of their crispy, skin-on French fries, drowned in malt vinegar and sea salt, topped off with a chocolate milkshake that she knew she wouldn't be able to finish. She groaned aloud in pleasure, already salivating. So bad, but so very good, she thought. She unwrapped the burger and dove in. Heaving a sigh of great pleasure, Zoe sat back and wiped her hands on one of her brown paper napkins, setting the extra ones aside for later out of habit. The cool, creamy froth of the milkshake melted over her ecstatic taste buds and down her throat. She let out another gusty sigh and blissfully closed her eyes. Why does something so bad have to taste so damn good? The only thing better would have been a trip to Pasquale's or Trevisi, her favorite Italian restaurants, or maybe that new Thai place she'd found. But that was too long of a wait on a day like today. Full now, she looked dubiously around at the boxes and firmly willed herself to get motivated again. She went to work and then, on impulse, climbed up the stairs and poked her head into Nana's bedroom. The last glowing shaft of the day's sunlight spilled over the windowsill and across the bed. Zoe leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and just stood there, absorbing the view. She'd always loved this room. Her gaze followed the golden ray of sun out the large window with its view to the backyard. The organized chaos of the garden exactly reflected the way Nana had lived. Beauty in perfect disarray, she thought with a smile. Nan had always exuded a sense of calm, quiet strength, of beauty, grace, class, and quiet elegance, seemingly without effort, allowing beauty to unfold in its own way, directing perhaps, but without holding on to any attachment to a specific outcome. That was the way that Nan had raised her, guiding without coercion, nurturing without smothering, supporting without controlling. She felt so very close to her here in this room, as if she could just close her eyes, and when they reopened, Nan would be looking at her, head slightly tilted to one side in that knowing way she had, smiling at her with that amazing, incredible love that shone directly out of the depths of her beautiful soul. She shook herself out of her reverie, pushing herself out of the room. "Stop," she told herself sternly. "This is not productive." On her way down the hall, she stopped and opened the door on the opposite side, the study. The large inviting room was her favorite room in the whole house. Scads of books of every description lined shelves on every wall, along with stones and crystals, both common and obscure, candles, curios, plants, carvings, statues, and interesting little mementos from her travels all over the world were scattered among each other. Small stacks of books piled up on nearly every flat surface, the desk, tabletops, wooden chairs, on the floor beside the worn but sturdy, overstuffed chairs and sofas, the coffee table, desk, and quaint mismatched little occasional tables. She loved the large, elaborately carved, smoke-kissed marble fireplace, with ashes now long gone cold. Large, plush, magenta velvet throw pillow with its faded golden tassels, the large hand-woven antique rug riddled with cryptic symbols from the Far East. In so many ways, it was an extension of Nan's rich life and her wonderful shop. This was the one room that the rest of the family had all seemed to avoid during the days following Nan's death and the funeral service. For the life of her, excuse me, Zoe couldn't figure out why. Sorry. But every one of them had walked right by the half-open door without so much as a curious glance inside, almost as if the room didn't even exist, which completely puzzled Zoe. because this room had always pulled her in like a moth drawn to flame. She couldn't have stayed away if she tried. Absently, she trailed her fingertips over treasures as she meandered through the beautiful room. She lowered herself into the plump brocade hassock next to the fireplace and reluctantly thought of that afternoon's events. She couldn't prevent the shudder of revulsion that gripped her in the unwilling recollection. The events occurring during the reading of Nan's will had extracted a toll on her. Several people had been present at the lawyer's office. A few she had met only briefly years ago at some family function or another, and several were unfamiliar to her entirely, including an exceedingly attractive man and woman who appeared quite bored with the proceedings. Impeccably groomed, they were extraordinarily tall and breathtakingly beautiful. Even the woman topped out over 6 feet. Zoe, feeling suddenly dowdy and short, remembered wondering if she were a model. Maybe both of them were. Both wore dark, costly suits with very shiny black Italian leather shoes. They towered over everyone in the room. Zoe had wanted to ask someone who these people were, but unfortunately, just then the lawyer had walked in and began his monologue. A few minutes in, a faint, unnatural, slightly irritating humming sound caused Zoe's brow to crinkle in discomfort. It permeated the room, an irksome, annoying sound, although no one else remarked on it or seemed to be taking notice of it. The reading first dispensed with several smaller items of little significance. A few of Nana's favorite charities were given bequeathments, and a number of antique pieces of furniture and artworks of moderate value were distributed among various family members. Nana's house and remaining contents were scheduled to Zoe, which was no surprise to anyone. Zoe had made no secret that had been her intent since Zoe had been a small child. The bothersome humming became louder and more insistent. A nasty, throbbing pain began to develop directly behind Zoe's right eye. And now to the matter of the late Ms. Engle's business affairs. The lawyer cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable, as if he suspected that this had the potential to become an awkward situation. The striking couple exchanged a sharp, significant glance with each other, and in unison incrementally leaned forward, training their gaze intently on the lawyer. As most of you doubtless will be aware, Ms. Engle had many business contacts around the globe, primarily, of course, for the import and export of her various rare and out-of-print books, rare art, pieces of estate jewelry, diverse artifacts, and the like, as well as associates, connections, and clientele that spanned the globe. The catalog property and the building itself were owned outright by Ms. Engle. The assets entailed within the property have been itemized, inventoried, detailed, and anything not remaining in the store inventory will be dispersed as follows. Zoe shuddered again, unwillingly remembering, even though she was safe here, sitting in Nan's study. She recalled the hot, swift wash of prickling, unnerving precognition, watching stupidly, feeling immobilized. In dawning horror, her eyes had been drawn irresistibly as the two tall, expensively dressed strangers leaned in that odd, curiously predatory manner towards the lawyer. Suddenly her vision flared, flickering back and forth as images of two horribly grotesque creatures, like vultures, were superimposed over the elegant human figures. They were utterly repulsive, like ghastly birds of scavenge, but not. There was something even more wrong with them. And what could be more wrong than human-like vultures, she wondered with detached irony. In place of the beautiful people now stood dingy, ragged, gray-black image of carrion feeders, appearing sickly gray, leathery, with gray wrinkled skin stretched taut over their skulls. Appendages like huge gray bat wings twitched behind their hunched shoulders. Sharp, slightly hooked beaks. No, that wasn't right. Were they snouts? That opened into a ghastly, revolting, mocking semblance of a smile. Long, needle-sharp, blackened teeth, making hideous, metallic, clicking sounds, only partially hiding the stumpy, dark blue, twitching, worm-like tongue. A tiny, terrified squeak of a sound fluttered in the back of Zoe's throat. She was suddenly thrown back into other times. A door, torn off her mind, ripped from its hinges, with the same screech of that metal car door in her childhood nightmare. horrifying monster in the darkness, the wreckage of the door dangling in its claws, hideous maw open, grinning, talons reaching for her. That unearthly, whining, humming, mind-splitting sound trying to turn her brain into a splatter of gray matter and blood. Fragments exploded into the surface of her consciousness, and a sense of surreal recognition, gripped her by the throat, squeezing hard. A different memory then, scattered, ragged memories of terror, along with the weight of the responsibility of a small, very precious child. Her child. A sudden, sickening sense of being flung through thin air, along with a slow motion, profound finality that just before inevitable, fatal impact. Another, and then another, and then another brutal snatch of memories slammed one on top of the other, jarring and shocking, cruel, shrieking shadows, screaming tires and crunching glass on wet pavement, blood, fear, desperation, death and loss, such deep, dragging, devastating loss. Waves pounding unforgiving rock, abrading, pummeling her consciousness. It was them. They had been there, these nightmare creatures, that night. All those nights. They had been there during every other horrible recollection that crashed through her stricken brain. Many creatures just like them. Too many. Soul eaters. Every night since, while she desperately flailed in the dark, viscous web of her recurring nightmares. And now, shiny and all black, cold eyes shifted hungrily back and forth over her with the hideous promise of grisly, merciless agony, a waft of the rancid, rotting stench rushing up her nostrils, filling her lungs, choking her, smothering her. And still the horrendous, relentless humming increased, painfully loud to her throbbing head, trembling on the brink of explosion. Cold sweat prickled painfully over her skin, over her back, and raced up her neck and scalp and face. She felt paralyzed, helpless, agonized. Smears of black and red sparkles obscured her vision, a grotesque dance of light and death and destruction, her hands and feet numb with ice. Her world tilted. Stop! Soundlessly, she fought back against them. Blackness reached out and overcame her ineffectual, hastily flung up defenses. Miss St. Clair? Miss St. Clair! Are you all right? Miss St. Clair! Goodness, I think the girl has fainted. Here now, help her. Someone perhaps get her some water. Zoe surfaced slowly up out of the thick, murky depths of the clutching darkness, completely disoriented, a strong sense of dread still grasping, sucking at her body, her limbs. She blinked and frowned. What had happened? So strange. She never fainted. Never. With some effort and dawning embarrassment, she found herself staring up at a circle of faces etched with varying degrees of concern. Abjectly mortified at the unwelcome attention she'd drawn to herself. Face flaming, her eyes jumped around the faces until they stuttered to a halt on the strange couple. They appeared now just as everyone else. Normal, with obviously feigned concern apparent on their indifferent, impassive faces. Thankfully, nothing more. Like the truth. She closed her eyes and repressed the deep shudder that went down to her core. So we blinked and automatically began apologizing to the room at large, studiously avoiding eye contact. Sitting up was difficult, but she accepted the preferred glass of cool water and swallowed, even though it did little to wash away the taste of ash. Gray, choking, fetid ash. Ash that tasted of all the horror of a slaughterhouse. Her muddled thoughts refused to marshal themselves into any semblance of order. The incessant buzzing had mercifully receded somewhat, although her head still pounded. She weakly waved off the helping hands, horribly self-conscious, wishing she could just escape. Cautiously, she took a deeper breath, grateful beyond relief that there was no trace in the air of that rank, putrid air that induced her gag reflex. She risked a quick glance again at the odd couple, and then wished she hadn't. Their narrowed eyes were sharply observing her. Although as soon as they detected her gaze touch theirs, their eyes flickered away and they were again cool, disinterested. A facade, a beautiful mask, slipping effortlessly into place. But she had glimpsed enough to know that their scrutiny had been no casual interest in her health. Some deep sense told her that they had been assessing her for a very different reason. An Arctic chill again crept its way up her spine, prickling icy fingers wrapping around her nerves with cold dread. But dread for what? She desperately wished she knew. The rest of the reading swam by in a blessed blur. She kept her head down and struggled to make some sense of the vision she had just experienced. She absorbed only enough to know that she had been left with the bulk of her grandmother's business, not including a few various items that had been consigned to Nan, and several articles that were awarded to those who were present, and a few that were not. She would not need to worry overly about her financial future. A relief, of course, but small recompense for losing her Nan. It was not enough, not even close. Nothing could make up for the jagged hole in her soul. The tall, expensively dressed vulture creatures, or whatever they really were, it was impossible now to think of them as beautiful any longer, appeared to have been dismissed with a large old tome in a sealed clear plastic bag and a thick sheaf of papers in a legal-sized brown envelope. They seemed to be satisfied with the transaction. She saw them briefly converse in low tones, flick another rapier glance of unsettling scrutiny in her direction, and then glide out together. She glanced at the lawyer beside her, a graying, familiar fixture since her youth. He chuckled softly and winked at her. "Don't worry, my dear. They didn't get anything but a ruse." Zoe looked at him quizzically, but another shiver made her stomach clench, and she swallowed convulsively. All she could think of was that she needed to get away. And so she had, after muttering sincere but brusque thanks and hasty farewells to her lawyer and other family members that had come. She couldn't help it. She shuddered again at the memory. She could not shake off the cold, creeping feeling that those creatures had somehow marked her for future interest. But that was ridiculous. Before that day, she would have sworn she'd never seen them before in her life. Thinking of it made her head pound again. There had to be a logical reason for what she'd experienced in the lawyer's office. She tried to calm herself with cool reason again, closing her eyes. Occam's razor. It had begun as a child's game, started by Nan when she was just a little girl, as an exercise to calm her when she'd become anxious about some situation or another. The simplest explanation that accommodates all of the variables is likely the solution, or truth. Despite its limitations, it had helped her in the past to get a handle on things, to think through them, and arrive at conclusions and decisions that she could live with. Okay. She blew out a breath. Well, at the moment, there were such a number of bizarre variables that gathering them all together might take a little time, and she had the strongest feeling that there was more yet to come. Something much bigger and much, much badder. She shook her head. Enough wool gathering. There was still work to do. She could work on the solution later. Determinedly, she gathered up her motivation, stood up, and went to work again, sorting out boxes and moving them to where they would be unpacked, then opened them and began that job while she still had some momentum. It was late and near midnight when she finally realized with some surprise that she'd nearly accomplished her goal. Looking around, it almost appeared like she lived here. Well, sort of, she amended. In her mind, it would always be Nana's place. That would never change, and in a fundamental way that was comforting. But at least she'd made a start tonight by moving some things around and adding her own things to the mix, changing the energy just enough that looking around her would not make her cry. Much, she hoped. Wearily, she made her way up to her bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out her pajamas. Stripping off her dusty clothing and pulling on her PJs, she picked up her robe and for a second was a little puzzled at how unexpectedly heavy it felt. Then she remembered and found the small metal box she tucked in there that night after that first episode. Intrigued anew by how substantial it felt for its size, she sat down on the edge of the bed and again studied the latch to see if she could figure out how it opened. There were two parts to it, she could see now. Clever little mechanism. Carefully, she pushed the first tiny lever down on the one side of the hasp, then pushed upward on the other side from an indentation on the bottom of the latch. The hinges were stiff and opened slowly but silently. The walls of the little box were thick, very nearly half an inch thick, which likely accounted for its weight, she guessed. Inside, the lining was of black velvety material which appeared very old and fragile. Her eyes widened and her mouth fell open as soon as she saw what was nestled inside. It was a ring, a very old ring by the look of it. The silvery setting lovingly cradled a large, dark, dusky gemstone. Smoky quartz, perhaps, or tourmaline, or maybe a very dark imperial topaz. She wasn't entirely sure. Beautiful, intricately scrolled details ordained the metal band, running like quicksilver with the light, and similar to the box, worn with age. The stone, roughly the width of her neatly trimmed index fingernail, was a deep, rich golden bronze color. Startlingly transparent even into its chocolatey depths, it was exquisitely faceted to display lively, bright, golden flashes of light, even in the deepest heart of the stone. She stared into the gem, feeling powerfully, inexplicably drawn into it. A feeling like nostalgic seemed strangely familiar and unbelievably dear to her, somehow. Almost as if this was something she had been searching for a long time and had finally found it. Which of course was ridiculous. Reverently she took it out of the box, holding it up to the light, openly admiring the sparkle and play of light inside the gem, almost like a living thing. Turning it over to look at the inside of the band, her eyes caught a very faint inscription that ran around the inside of the band, though it was difficult to decipher. It appeared to be a language foreign to her, odd in itself. She needed to dig out her magnifying glass to get a better look. She turned, trying to remember where she'd unpacked it. Not again. Suddenly that same, now recognizable sense of a rushing, tilting, sliding, reality-altering vertigo and unearthly chimes overcame her senses again. Not quite, but nearly as violently as the first time in her kitchen. She sat very still, trying hard to contain the sensations, to control it, manage it. Squeezing her eyes tightly shut, bracing herself, clasping the ring very tightly in her palm, its edges digging painfully into her flesh. Determinedly she dragged in one harsh breath, then two, through her nose, determined to retain control of her senses. She concentrated on slowing her breathing down, just in, out, for several moments, until she felt the sensation of being tipped sideways on an oiled surface level out just a little. Okay, that was better. On an exhale, she cautiously opened her eyes and blinked in utter disbelief. There was a huge man standing in the center of the room. Her heart stuttered. A careful stillness wrapped about him like an invisible cloak, a suspended reality, his body immobile. All 7 freaking feet of him, or thereabouts, staring down right at her with intense, unreadable, strangely iridescent silver eyes. Holy crap on a cracker, she thought. This could not be happening. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe she'd fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. If only. Zoe's breath caught, frozen in place, eyes wide, paralyzed, unable to think, unable to even get air in her lungs. By all rights, by any known logic, her first and immediate response to seeing a huge, unknown man standing in her bedroom should have been pure, unadulterated terror. But the strangest, weirdest, strongest, most incongruent sense came over her. There was no way she could have said how. Even though she was sure she had never seen this man before, she was absolutely 100% certain that she knew him intimately, and he was unquestionably safe. That she was safe with him. Mind-bending. Her reason strained, tugging at her frantically, firmly and insistently informing her that she did not know who the hell this man was, that there was no way that she knew that she was safe, and she damn well better do something. Scream for help, run, pick up something to use as a weapon, call the police, anything. Just do something instead of gaping like a fish yanked out onto dry land. But all of those thoughts sputtered to a halt. Some other absurd part of her thought processes had gone decidedly AWOL, was singing through her veins, stealing all other thought. It keened inside of her, soaring through unused synaptic connections, urging her to burrow into his arms, weep with the unparalleled joy of finally seeing him again, to clutch him close to her and never ever let him go, as if he were some dear, sorely missed, long believed dead friend. And no, not just any friend. This had the desperate, tragic taste to it, like a reunion of destined, star-crossed soulmates after a forced, torn-apart severance. As corny as it sounded, true love. Real, straight, strong, tight, clean love. The kind of love that burned deep within the bone. A blinding, dazzling revelation. She'd been in love before. Maybe. Doubt tugged at her now. But not this. Certainly not ever like this. Not even close. Not this unexplained, white-hot ferocity. And yet, him, was not new. It felt old, older than dirt, older than the stars. Standing in front of her was the missing half of her heart, her being, her soul. Come home at last. No, 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 she shook her head, fighting it, denying its truth, trying to divine some logical answer. This is ridiculous, too strange, too bizarre. Confusing, intimate flashes of memories teased and tumbled at the edges of her consciousness, drawing her into a weird, strange twilight of feeling. What was going on here? The two disparate parts of her tangled, warred fiercely, violently torn, veering from one extreme to the other, with the end result being, apparently, paralysis. Still another remote, inexplicable part of her suddenly foreign brain wanted to stand there like a slack-jawed idiot and simply admire, appreciate the huge, flawlessly sculpted body in front of her. Somehow a body that she knew. The feeling was gut-deep, visceral. She knew by heart the devastatingly beautiful face before her, could with her eyes closed see its square, purposeful jaw, the strong, perfectly chiseled nose, the full, savagely carved lips, the bottom lip fuller than the top one, dark slanted brows, the long black lashes framing turbulent, half-lidded, molten silver eyes, burned into her retinas. Savage, commanding power rolled off him in nearly tangible waves. The man was wearing some kind of a long, dark coat over black clothing. Although his body language appeared carefully non-threatening, his stance alluded to an alert readiness. But it was those strange eyes that riveted her, drew her in, filled with incredible... what was it? Desire? Compassion? Longing? Craving? For her? It boggled the mind. Her brain fought for logic again. A huge man, hello, here, in her house, in the same room with her, as still and perfect as a marble statue. She wasn't sure of motives, knew only that he continued to gaze deeply with that strange, intense anticipation into her eyes. Patient, so patient, infinitely so. Waiting. Pleading? For what? Her confused mind scrambled for the answer. Any answer. But nothing about this made any sense. Damn it, the towering man before her was vividly compelling, but frustratingly inscrutable. Her gaze searched, clung to his, seeing a careful distance, as if not wanting to startle her. And still, he leaked raw, carnal sensuality. Naked want, just barely, scarcely, held in rigid check. Zoe's thoughts softened, wandered dreamily, knowing how it would be to feel how it would feel to run her palms, her fingertips, her lips over the wide expanse of a warm, solid chest, to nuzzle into his strong neck, to have his arms wrapping, enclosing her in an intimate and secure embrace, a safe haven. To deeply inhale that intoxicating scent she'd never been able to breathe enough of, to simply absorb him through her pores. Oh, what she wouldn't give just to feel again. Him. Her eyes drifted close. Her brain again suddenly gave her a jolt, a small mental electric charge. What the hell? Good God, what is wrong with you? The logical part of her brain overrode her circuits again, like a defibrillator charge, shrieking out a frantic alarm. What are you thinking? There is a strange man here, in your house, in your room. Come on, you idiot. Do something. Scream, run, throw something sharp and hard. Just do something. Her eyelids snapped open at the same time as she opened her mouth, finally managing to drag in enough air to scream, the hand not holding the precious ring, searching, groping for something to use to defend herself, and then stopped, mid-breath. The room was empty. She was alone. Completely alone. Panicked, she looked around her, her breath still caught in the middle of her throat. Nothing. There was no one there. Zoe's legs abruptly gave out. She sat down on the floor. Hard. Ouch. The room looked exactly the same as when she had entered it. What had just happened? Could she have imagined it all? Was that even possible? No, she thought, shaking her head, still clutching the ring tightly in her hand. It was real. It was. I am not going crazy. There is no way my imagination is that vivid. There's no way that anyone's imagination is that vivid. But if he had been real, then where was he now? Who was he? Okay, Zoe. Pull it together. Snap out of it. You don't do hallucinations. That sort of thing just doesn't happen to you, to normal people. She, who'd never indulged in anything stronger than a glass or two of wine to alter her reality, she really needed to get a hold of herself. Her self-directed tongue lashing delivered, she scrubbed her face with her palms, pushing her fingers through her hair, blinked and slowly pushed herself back to her feet. Her bottom already felt bruised from the abrupt contact it had made with the worn hardwood floor. She inhaled, not dwelling on the thought that it had sounded more like a sob. Held it for a few seconds and then blew out a long, shuddering breath. She could hear her heart still loudly hammering inside of her ribs, and she felt slightly lightheaded, nauseated. Was this the onset of some terrifying mental illness? Oh, God, she hoped not. A groan fled from somewhere in her chest. She was pretty sure that regular people just did not experience random visions of massive men in the middle of their bedroom. A massive, beautiful man, her mind amended. A fantasy, maybe. She choked on a laugh. Oh, God. Why would it matter one bit if he was beautiful or hideous? She argued briefly with herself and then gave up. Great, she thought in disgust. I'm actually losing an argument with myself. Just then, as if to confirm her suspicions of delusion, incredulously she heard a faint voice in her head. A man's resonant voice, quiet, as if from a long distance away. She shook her head in denial, trying to dislodge the sound, and failed. Please, do not be afraid, Onomeos. I will not harm you. I would never ever cause you hurt. She swiveled her neck, vainly trying to pinpoint the source of the voice that was just as exquisite as the vision had been. There was no doubt in her mind exactly who belonged to that voice, that huge, gorgeous man. She shook her head again in the chaos of her thoughts and feelings. Not that it was relevant now anyway. There was no longer anyone here, if there ever had been. Zoe closed her eyes. No way. This was just not happening. Vertigo, visions, voices. Yep, crazy. For sure, she'd be checking herself into a hospital. First thing Monday morning. Yep. Provided, that is, she was still lucid enough to drive. And that concludes chapter 3. Hope you stay tuned for the next one. Thank you so much for listening.